Hello, welcome to our weekly teaching here at Living Springs. We are continuing in our Close Encounters series. Now, this is totally a ripoff of the Close Encounters of the Third Kind, a movie I am too young to have seen in its heyday, and I missed the window of even kind of rewatching it. So I'm aware of its name and title and effect culturally, while not actually having ever seen it. But I know the principle is that there's an encounter with an alien being that is revolutionary to a couple characters and to the world, and that is entirely what this whole series is aiming to explore. That in the post-resurrection encounters with Jesus, there is something that shakes the lives of those who encounter him and those of us who follow after hearing of these stories. There is something world-changing within them. And so for this series between Easter and Pentecost, which is actually the season of Easter, though most of the Protestant church has missed kind of recognizing that is a season, not just a day, we find ourselves in the midst of this season. And so for this week, we actually turn to the Gospel of Mark in chapter 16, verses 1 to 8. So I would love to read it. If you're in a place where you are willing and able and not too inconvenient, would you stand or maybe just shift your body in a way of recognizing as we jump into reading of Scripture? So Mark 16, 1 to 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, who will roll away the stone from the entrance to the tomb? But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white robes sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go tell the disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. This story begins in a strangely familiar place if you've been following along with our series so far. In our first week, Doug spoke from the Gospel of Matthew, where the women there at the encounter were in the same characters, the same setting, same interactions, a lot of the same details. And so we come again, and all of this seems very familiar. That is because the Synoptic Gospels overlay much of their content, especially when it comes to resurrection and post-resurrection details, where Jesus has encountered and told the story through Mark, which is likely the earliest of the Gospels, and then the other ones carry on sharing those details, adding from their own recollections, or in Luke's case, their research, to continue the story and widen and add particular details for the way they are trying to tell it. But Mark, likely being the first of the Gospels, tells his story here and is very familiar for those of us who've been following the story or in this series. But these women are coming to Jesus' tomb, and they are there, sad and sorrowful. They are coming to Jesus' tomb where they witnessed, or at least Mary Magdalene for sure, Mark records, had been a witness to the burying of Jesus' body, and so she knows where she's coming. What is not being stated in this, though, is how uncomfortable these women really is. The scene really is awkward and not how it's supposed to be if you stop to look at the details of what is not there, what is not present. Where are the 12 disciples, Jesus' most faithful 12 that are supposed to be there, the ones he personally called and invited to follow him? They are nowhere to be found. The women who are there are there with items for burial when Jesus had promised them that he was going to resurrect, and they cannot hear it. They have their grief, their doubts, their sorrow to cling to in this moment, and that seems to be all. The only remaining characters are the grieving women, who are themselves unable to hear the words of Jesus, or at least believe them after his death and now resurrection. They've come with emblems for burial, and they are there just to simply carry on doing what is right in honoring Jesus, but they don't seem to have hope for something greater. We all have felt this grief, their doubts and sorrow that they cling to in this moment. They are here with these deep feelings of lament. The death of their close friend, who is supposed to be their savior as far as they imagine and has now been taken from them, And all they have to hold on to is that. Their hope for a better world for their nation, the people of Israel, for themselves, for maybe some of them kids, has been robbed and taken away. They imagined Jesus was going to paint a better world and make a better place, and without him on the scene and their inability to believe he is still with them, actually robs them and leaves them in this scenario. So it is not being said, though some of us want to rush forward and hear because of our knowledge that Jesus is risen, we miss what Mark is trying to show us. I think all of us know these feelings if we name them far too well. We can join in these women of verses 1 to 3 and where they sit. Maybe it's the grief we carry around the Jesus that we hoped or maybe we're told to expect and doesn't act in the ways and show up in our lives the way we would demand or expect of our own volition. Maybe it's the doubts we wrestle with of Jesus being who he was supposed to, or his ability to rise, like these women had heard that, but then he's gone and now they find themselves carrying the emblems for burial because they cannot bear to get past their doubt of his ability to conquer death. Maybe it's not just in Jesus, but our lack of hope or in the world that we live in. Here on the tail end of an election cycle in Canada and feeling the weight of the most recent one in the States, for our context, where powers of the world lob throws back and forth, leaving everyday people to feel the wake of those consequences. And so the financial strain and insecurity we may be facing and suffering, or the sorrows just of life feel like enough of sickness and death and loss and unfairness. We know the feelings of these women. And so the incredible beauty of the story where Mark begins it is here, and for these women and ever since, encountering Jesus is almost always through the sorrows and the depth of the heavy things in life, not through the great and the grandiose ones. It is in the depth of their sorrow and their sadness that then makes a way and a vehicle into the encounter of the hope of Jesus. It is not through their own success or stories or their own ability to hold on and buckle down, but instead through their willingness to go through the walk and the journey towards the cross to face their grief, that then Jesus is able to encounter them. We have a propensity ourselves to buckle up or tie ourselves down to hope and this belief and just pretend we have it all together. But that is not the way in which we find Jesus on the other side of things. Encountering Jesus almost always is through the depths of these things that we carry. And so Mary and the other Mary and Salome, they then, as Mark encounters it, then at one moment, while going through this place and this posture, they look up. It is only those of us who are willing to acknowledge our brokenness and that there is much in this world to lament and to have our heads hung over that then have the ability to be invited to look up, to be able to hear the story and the declaration of the risen Jesus. And so for those of us that in church cultures want to then put on the happy face or pretend that we believe it all the time and nothing's ever going wrong, there's actually a resistance to the invitation to believe and to be called into looking up and growing in faith of Jesus. So let me just tell you this as the first point of Mark's gospel, that we are to be people, it is okay to be people who can recognize the sorrow, the grief, the lament, the as it ought not to be of this world, so that we can encounter the risen Jesus. I have this next section in my notes actually listed as interlude. Just a little bit of a sidestep conversation as we continue in Mark's narrative, but some things we have to understand about the process of receiving the Bible that we actually do. Through the work of textual criticism and biblical criticism, the work of manuscripts that we have. The passage before us is most fascinating once we understand the Bible that was written and how that process has brought it to us. The Bible that we have today has been diligently and carefully put together by comparing and contrasting manuscripts that have been given to us over time. We don't have, until about the 4th century, a full, complete version of the New Testament. And so by no means is that anywhere near the originals. Our oldest known complete manuscript of the New Testament is the Codex Sinaiticus, a 4th century document. Other than that, we have fragments of most of the Gospels, not anything much earlier than the 2nd century, middle of the 2nd century, as the earliest manuscripts we have, and even then they're just fragments. And so when we think of this work and this process, and I really would consider it an art, we then get to a different picture of what's happening here. And Mark's gospel, you may see in the footnotes of your Bible, Mark's gospel actually ends at verse 8, where we read today, where these women have been told of the resurrected Jesus. They have not yet encountered him, and then they are told to go and to tell others, and they don't do so out of fear and amazement, and then it just ends. The added ending there, I do not believe is original to Mark's writing, nor do the majority of scholars that I'm able to be aware of. Some absolutely debate this, but Mark's gospel ends abruptly and uncomfortably. It is an ending that most of us, even right now, are as uncomfortable as people always through biblical history have been, because that's why early Christians in the 2nd and maybe 3rd century added these extended endings of what Mark must have really meant to add, we should put in so nobody mistakes that the risen Jesus was encountered. And so that they then borrow details from Matthew and Luke, potentially, to finish the work that Mark stopped and didn't do. Mark's ending defies control and overturns all of our expectations. I remember the first time I watched the movie Inception, where it ends with this massive cliffhanger. It's like, 15 years old, so no spoiler. Spoiler alert shouldn't be needed, and if not, I don't feel bad. Where it ends with this thing where you don't know, and now I, for the first time ever, went to a movie theater a second time to see a movie, where I would go back to try to figure out all these details. I went to the Late Show the first night I saw it, so I went home and read up on all these blogs on what the ending actually meant, and then went back within a week to go and see the movie again to try to catch all the details. I think Mark has done the same by ending with this short, abrupt, unhelpful ending. He wants us to go back and to wrestle with these things. There are many implications, a couple of which we will wrestle with, of why this is good, but the first and probably most directly applicable for us as modern readers, so far separated from the resurrected Jesus, is that the first people to be commanded to go and tell and live in the light of the resurrected Jesus didn't get to see him before they were qualified to do so. So those of us who have been jealous and envious of the people of the New Testament who got to walk with Jesus and encounter him, the first ones told to go and tell of him, according to Mark, had not seen him before they were qualified to do so. And so when I have insecurities, when I have doubts, when I have jealousies around not having gotten to walk with that Jesus, that is not enough to disqualify me from the experience of the resurrected Jesus. In fact, if Mark's gospel ends here at verse 8, this sermon doesn't actually fit our series intention, where it's the encounters with the resurrected Jesus, because these three women do not encounter Jesus, they just encounter the story of the resurrection and then are encouraged to go forward from there. And so we then are welcome to the same. There's a relief for those of us who feel like we don't have enough or have not been equipped with enough to experience Jesus or to tell of him. And the first people to be qualified to do so, like us, had not yet encountered the risen Jesus. So first take solace. But then Mark's formatting begins to just lay multiple things again on its head. I have to admit, the more I learn about the Gospel of Mark, the more uncomfortable he makes me. It is so in my face and punches me in the gut, and it is so what I need, and I think many of us do. There's a beautiful lens introduced in early in Mark by which I think we're intended to examine every character throughout the remainder of his narrative. In Mark chapter 4, the famous passage, the parable of the sower, is introduced, where there are 4 types of soil to represent 4 types of ways people may hear and receive the message of Jesus. First, those who are like the pathway more than soil. The message of Jesus does not take root and is even taken out of their life before it can begin to take root or bear fruit. There are those who are shallow and rocky soil, who are quick to respond, but just as fast, it seems, to be pushed away when they face any sort of trouble or tribulation amongst those beliefs or with their own doubts. There's the weedy soil where we let the worries and concerns and desires for other things crowd out the growing of the work of Jesus into our hearts by the weeds and desires that we allow to permeate our spirits and our souls and our minds, even our lives. And then there are lastly those who hear the word, accept it, and produce a crop. And so this is the lens by which I think every character gets looked at. And Mark constantly portrays not just the religious elites who the other gospel writers seem to also highlight in bad faith, but Mark picks out the disciples and makes them look terrible on a regular occasion. He uses his narrative and this lens to show the 12 disciples do not match the fourth soil. In fact, they far more often match the three. Throughout the gospel, the disciples themselves display those who will hear but not understand. They listen to Jesus, but they don't do as they should. When the disciples are told of Jesus' death and resurrection, they don't believe. They rebuke Jesus at times. They fight with one another for prominence, and they seek power and privilege, and they constantly fail to be the kind of people that Jesus invites us to at the beginning of Mark. Meanwhile, it's the least likely characters who consistently respond faithfully to Jesus in the work of Mark. It's the poor widow, it's the Syrophoenician woman, it's the demon-possessed man set free, it's the woman with the issue of blood. The characters who are down and out, who are actually the ones who respond faithfully to Jesus. There is so much hope then at the point of this narrative. Of those who we expect should be able to follow Jesus, maybe they'll finally get it right. These women encounter into this tragic situation. Instead, Jesus has powerfully reversed the powers of sin and death, and he's raised and crucified, and Mark's audience are primed, ready to enjoy seeing these women finally then go out and testify and follow faithfully to Jesus. And they fail to do so. These women, stunningly, as Mark records, they are given everything right, just like the disciples were, and they then are told to go and to proclaim, and they fail to do so. It ends with, and trembling and bewildered, the women went out, fled from the tomb, and said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Mark's gospel ends again in this utter disillusionment of those who are supposed to be able to follow Jesus, who are set up and equipped well to do so, constantly fail. The same dynamic of drift and desertion finds itself again on the pages of Mark to end it, and then abruptly just closes, leaving us so hopeless in so many ways. It is so in our faith, the desire to want to be comfortable of knowing that we might be enough. And so these women who are equipped with everything they need, a supernatural encounter, the proof of the risen Jesus with the empty tomb, they fail to do so. And so the in our face and in my face challenge of this is that I cannot think that I am ever close or comfortable enough on the inside of the story to be able to be above failure. The impressing upon Mark's reality, or Mark's audience, a sobering reality that it's possible to follow Jesus for an extended period of time, to hear his teaching, to study his word for us, to hear his predictions and be well motivated and still be mired in misunderstanding, to still fail to do as he called us to. The 12 are nowhere to be seen, these women fail it, and so do I. They said nothing to anyone for they were afraid. The gospel seems to come to a dead end despite the resurrection, and literally no one in the inside group in the story remains faithful. And so we are invited into a risky journey of faith with the condition and the stark warning in Mark's characters, as well as to ourselves. Nobody is above failing in this. So this ending is terrifying to me. It in no way causes concern for me in the resurrection of Jesus, and I think there's much evidence to testify about that. But it sure casts a shadow on my confidence about how good of a follower and faithful of a follower I can think myself to be. That Mark's gospel has portrayed every follower of Jesus who is close to him and supposed to be being changed by him. None of them are above bickering or fighting, and none of them are above failing to listen to Jesus. And regardless of my good intentions, my proximity to Jesus by his word or time with him, do I actually know him? Mark's call leaves us so uncomfortable. Am I actually listening to Jesus? Do I allow him to know me? Do I know him? Will I do what he asks? Am I just a seat warmer who might want to hear Jesus and say the right things and be good intentioned and then fail to be a follower? There's a stark warning throughout this whole gospel that we are all prone to be the faithless abandoners of Jesus and his way. That so many of us inside the church get so confident because we know enough or have done it or have followed it for a long time, or we read our Bibles or we attend church. And Mark's gospel says, don't let it get to your head. You are not above failure. You will likely fail. But take heart. Though these warnings of Mark are heavy, take heart. God's grace and faithfulness go beyond it. God's goodness and grace and faithfulness won't be stopped by any character mark or even in our own day. None of their failures, nor mine, nor yours. In a gospel so filled with human failure, God's faithfulness is the continuing response. There are so many elements to make this the resounding end to Mark, no matter how doom-like it may seem. First is that neither the absence of a resurrection appearance nor the fear and silence of the women or our consistent failure deafens Mark's word as good news. Emerson Powery states that for Mark, hope is not defined by a resurrection or a physical appearance even, but by an empty tomb and a promised regathering. The empty tomb stands as the defining mark that Jesus is resurrected and that there's a regathering that has been promised and a fixed event on the calendar in Jesus' mind. He has told them ahead of time before his death and resurrection, I will meet you again in Galilee. And so even if these women fail to do it, Jesus believes that we will be regathered, and against even our best efforts to fail, we will be gathered under him. And so the faithful call to Jesus is that regardless of my ability to fail and to not gather or to miss his message, just like theirs, there is a fixing in Jesus' mind of his people will be gathered because he has promised and stated that we'll do so. Two, that narratively, there's a failure of disciples for all who have failed Jesus, yet Mark's community that is standing there listening to this and including us know that somebody must have said something. So even though the women have failed to do so at the end of this story, somebody talked because we are here gathered around this message and this hope now. And so regardless of if they failed or the disciples abandoned or if I fail, Jesus' work will ring out. He is speaking and calling to this world today as he was then, that the community and the community of Jesus will be grown and will be strengthened by his call and by his spirit, regardless of our own initiatives. Jesus himself is first the invitation to come and see, not to go and tell, or first invites us to come and see before we are invited to go and tell. It's this beautiful thing where the women encounter the angel, and he says, come in and see the tomb, before he ever says, then go tell. And so when we fail, when we have doubts, Jesus' invitation first is come see. Come look, examine the life that I have. When you feel like you've failed and you've done enough, come and watch me be at work in my life. Come and see my grace. And so he calls us, do you still have doubts? Do you have questions? Did you fail? Come look upon my work. And then from there, from the invitation to come and see, then I will say, go and tell. And so we cannot overcome that. Fourth is that there is grace and forgiveness for our failure. The angel's call is really specific and uniquely phrased. When he gives them the command, he says, but go and tell the disciples and Peter, which is really interesting phrasing because Peter is one of the disciples. So why add Peter when he is already a part of the group that was first mentioned? Well, just before his Passover, before his crucifixion at the Passover meal, amongst predicting Judas' betrayal and Peter's denial, now Jesus is saying, I want you to go and tell Peter, regardless of his denial of me, go tell him that I am here. He will not, Jesus' grace and forgiveness will not allow our failure and beating up of ourselves and self-condemnation to ring out. And I'm sure that's what's in Peter's mind. And so Jesus, seeing not just the whole picture, but specifically Peter in this moment through the messenger of the angel, gives me much hope. It is not that just Jesus' church will be at work, though that is true, but that Jesus sees and forgives me is also the promise I need to hear, the call to faithfulness and the specific word over my life. And then last is that Jesus is on the move. As C.S. Lewis captures around his character Aslan. Aslan is on the move. Jesus is on the loose. The women don't encounter him here because the angel says he's gone ahead of you to Galilee like you promised. And the invitation is not to stay here, but to go and explore and chase him down. There is a creator who has rolled away stones, who has conquered death, who is doing all these things in the world in their story. And it is not stick around and figure it out. It is go and find him and discover him. Jesus is on the move. And so at the end of this story, where Mark abruptly ends it, almost rudely, where nobody said it, the disciples all failed, the women failed, they did not testify of it. The ending of that, the blank canvas, is, will there be a people? As Mark cries out to his audience then and to us as his audience now, will you be the people who go and to testify and explore and discover the goodness of Jesus? So God's grace, God's goodness goes above our ability to fail while still inviting us to recognize the discomfort of Mark's gospel of anybody is not above it, but God's grace is still yet above that. And so to push through our doubts, to push through our sorrows and grief and encounter Jesus there, that we might discover God's goodness and grace and then live out and participate in his good message and in his story. I have a couple of reflection questions for you then as we just process this. If you've got somebody with you, feel free to talk them out. But first, what are the sorrows and griefs that you're trying to hold at bay instead of journeying into them where you might encounter Jesus? Second, would you take a moment to reflect on your insider status? Am I truly listening to Jesus and following him? Or am I just feeling comfortable on the inside? And the last, do I trust the grace and faithfulness of God above all else? And if so, where is he asking me to respond in participation? These are our questions, and if you've got a question for us, feel free to jump onto our podcast website, invertedorthodoxy.com, where you can submit a question there. But it would be my great joy to bless you in our closing. So if you would raise your hands wherever and whenever you're watching this in a way of receiving it. Go now in the echo of the words, he has risen. May the risen Christ go before you in every place of fear and uncertainty that you walk in. And may you trust that even in your silence, God is still speaking. Amen. Thanks for joining with us, and we will catch you next time as we continue this series, Close Encounters.